Hello and welcome back to Reach, a GABC students podcast that exists to encourage, train, and equip students to live for Christ and to reach those around them with this message of hope. My name is Max, and I'm the youth pastor here at Golden Acres Baptist Church. And today, I actually don't have one of my students here with me. I've got my wife, Makayla, one of our awesome youth leaders with us. It's our first episode with a leader, so what better leader to start out with than Makayla. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of people pleasing and some of the dangers that come with it. So if you're a people pleaser, or maybe even if you think you're not, listen in because we might reveal some things that maybe bring to light some tendencies you have that you didn't even know were there. But regardless, stick around, check out this episode with Makayla on people pleasing. All right. So, Makayla, first leader on the pod.
Yes.
Welcome in.
Thank you.
We're
Thank
so
you.
glad you're here. And so, normally with our topics, we let students kind of pick topics that have a little bit to do with their story. And so, that's where I want to start with you to let you have the chance, have the opportunity to share your kind of whole story with our audience, with our students, and then we'll unpack a little bit of our topic after that. And so, when I talk about sharing your story, we've been doing that in three parts, right? What does your life look like before Jesus? When did you decide to place your faith in him? And what has he done in your life since then? So share a little bit about your faith background and your relationship with Christ.
Okay. So I grew up in church. We went to church every Sunday, most Wednesdays. We were always there unless we were out of town or sick. Like we were at church. And I got saved in VBS. I remember it was our kids minister. Her name was Miss Casey. And she actually had a conversation with me, made sure I understood who Jesus was, who he would be in my life, and what a relationship with him would look like. And so I had a really good upbringing in kids ministry, and even more so like in a youth group growing up. I eventually got baptized. I think it was 2015. So I think, 14 years old, and my dad baptized me at my church. And that was something that I truly believed. I knew what I was doing. Um, and then COVID hit, and I kind of fell off of the wagon a little bit and stopped attending church, just with all the shutdowns and everything. I don't think there was as much accountability as I needed, as new as I was in my faith at the time. And I was with a lot of friend groups that I shouldn't have been with. And I was doing things that I shouldn't have been doing. And I really put my relationship with God on the back burner. And I think it really took an event in my life for me to really realize how much I needed God. I think he brought me to such a place of what felt to me like isolation in order to bring his presence known in my life, and that I needed to, you know, have that desire in my heart for him again, and that I truly couldn't do life without him, and that I was missing out on so much joy and so much peace that he was just so willingly giving to all of those who believe, by not actively pursuing a relationship with him. So since then, in the last few years, I mean, my life has completely like flipped around. Um, the way that I think, the way that I act. I mean, he's just totally transformed my life, and I've just seen him work in so many beautiful ways, that can't be explained by anything but him. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one interesting part of your story, I mean, the whole thing's interesting, but one thing that stuck out to me was you mentioned getting to kind of a place of isolation.
mm-hmm.
And as we talk about people pleasing, sometimes that can come from a place of isolation of we want
Absolutely.
more people around us. We want people to like us. We don't want to be isolated, so we think we've got to, make everyone else around us happy so they
Yeah.
want to be around us. And so I don't know if I may be reaching there, but talk a little bit about why you picked this topic. Like, was it just one that you felt you could talk a lot about, or one that maybe did play a part of your story?
No, I think it's definitely one that played a huge part in my story, and this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because it's still something that I struggle with, like today. Granted, I handle it differently, and I deal with it in a different way than I did in years past. But it's still something that I struggle with today. Like, that I just love to make people happy. I love to show up for people. I can't say no most of the time, and I will run myself ragged and into just a season of burnout over it. And so the Lord has really taught me a lot over the last few years about my people pleasing tendencies and how harmful it can be. And it's just something I'm really passionate about, because I've experienced the effects of it firsthand. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of getting more into this topic then of people pleasing. And it's a really interesting topic because it's one that I think used to be talked about a lot, but I've
mm-hmm.
begun noticing it being talked about less and less because society kind of as a whole has become so much more focused on making ourselves happy so that people pleasing is kind of getting ignored now because we're so focused on making ourselves happy, doing what
Mm-hmm.
we want, all this self-love, all of that kind of stuff. And so we almost don't realize that there's still so many of us trying to draw our happiness from other people and the
Right.
like you said the dangers of that, how that can go wrong. And so obviously like you said, we want to make others happy,
Yeah.
right? Unless you're someone out there that you just hate everyone and you want to make people sad, but generally we like pleasing people. We like making other people happy. And so when we talk about people pleasing, what are we talking about, right? What is people pleasing and what are some signs that we might struggle with people pleasing?
Mm-hmm. So I actually took it upon myself to just get a definition for a people pleaser. It's someone who has a strong desire to please others, often at the expense of their own needs and desires, and they are someone who often wants to avoid conflict. That really speaks to me and who I was for a lot of years, and even now sometimes. Like I said, I deal with it differently now, but I feel like the first sign is feeling like you can't say no, or feeling like you have to live for the approval of other people. And that's where I often put my worth in. I feel like a lot of people who are people pleasers, they have this, or from my experience, I had this sense of insecurity. And that stemmed from placing my worth in what people thought of me and my perception from other people. And so instead of, placing my worth in who God says I am and who I know He says I am, I made that dependent on what people said about me, how people responded to me, if people wanted to be around me. And I would run myself ragged, trying to do everything that I could to please other people just to make myself feel quote unquote good, because I thought that was making me feel fulfilled. I thought that's what made me feel loved. I thought that's what made me feel liked by people, is if I just constantly said yes. And another thing that I dealt with was guilt when I would say no. And that was something that was like devastating to me, because on the other hand of that, I always thought that when I said no to people, oh my gosh, they hate me. They're not going to want to be my friend. They're not going to want to be around me. And again, that just made my self worth plummet. And so that's where a lot of my insecurity came from. And I feel like a lot of people pleasing tendencies are from a deeper rooted problem that needs to be addressed. Like, it's more of a symptom or a sign of some other underlying issue that you really need to work through. And for me, I dealt with a lot of anxiety and like depression in high school and in the beginning of college, that I just would not give to God, and I just held on to it. And people pleasing was a tendency of mine that represented like how deeply I was hurting inside, I feel like. And I just kind of ignored it and neglected that part of me.
Yeah.
So,
And in the definition you mentioned, it was about like avoiding conflict,
yes.
right? And like kind of this thought, and I think that's where a lot of that anxiety and stress would come from, is like this thought that if I can just keep other people around me happy, then everything is going to be smoother,
Yeah.
right? Everything is just easier if I can just say yes to this, do what's asked of me, and then we all just avoid this conflict. But I think it
Yeah.
also, kind of like you mentioned, comes from a deeper place where we find ourselves striving for acceptance. And so ultimately, I would say a people pleaser is someone who, like you said, is looking for their joy, looking for their identity in other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we've kind of identified it the way you did so thoroughly, and then the little bit that I shared, like we kind of have to peel that back a little bit even more so. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, obviously you being out of high school, out of college, all those things as an adult, kind of looking back, I guess, on your time in middle school, high school, what are some ways or some situations maybe in which people pleasing can be a temptation?
Ooh, okay. I think high school for me, um, getting my driver's license was like a new sense of freedom, I feel like. And I think that heightened my want to people please. And it put me in very bad situations that I shouldn't have been in at 16, 17, 18, 19 years of age. I was hanging out with a lot of friend groups because I had the freedom to go and do that. I didn't have my parents, dropping me off or asking to talk to their parents, or um, I just had that lack of accountability, I guess. And so instead of viewing the things I was doing as wrong, I was viewing them as things that would allow me to be seen and liked and involved. And it would make my friends happy if I went to a party with them. But the entire time in the back of my mind, I knew that it was wrong. But my desire to be accepted and loved was so much stronger than the fear of what would happen if I got caught or the consequences of my actions. And that's where it gets really dangerous, is when you almost talk yourself out of being fearful of the consequences for the sake of being loved and seen by people. So,
Yeah. And I think you hit on a big one there of just, our relationship with others.
mm-hmm,
And we think it's going to, give us that friend group, or we might lose that friend group if we say
yeah,
no. And so I think a people pleaser might be faced with something that, is wrong, but
mm-hmm,
like you said, you're afraid of what others might say more so than you're afraid of the consequences of saying yes,
yeah,
right? We kind of have it flipped in our mind to where we're more fearful of what they'll think if I say no, rather
mm-hmm,
than being fearful of what the consequences may be of me saying yes.
right,
And I think another big one that comes from that same place is relationships,
yes,
especially in middle and high school, where relationships are the end of the world and like the most
yeah,
important things. Like a lot of times in relationships, we try to be somebody that we're not for the purpose of trying to make our boyfriends or girlfriends happy, because we want that person to be happy and we care so much about them and we're so in love, and we just
mm-hmm,
have something inside of us to where it doesn't feel good if we aren't giving them what they want.
yeah,
But we know that we can't always do what other people ask us to do,
right,
right? Because that's going to lead us down a dark path. And the
absolutely.
Bible talks a lot about that as well. And so you've already hit on this a little bit, but just to give it its own time here on this episode, what kind of threat does people pleasing pose to the gospel and to really living out what God has for us, right? Like, how can, I guess, being so focused on pleasing others cause us to really lose focus of what God has for us?
Yeah. Um, well, I want to read this verse that I was looking at whenever I was kind of diving into this topic a little bit deeper. It's Galatians 1, verse 10. For am I now trying to persuade people or God? Or am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. So it blatantly puts it out there for you that if you are pleasing people, then you're not truly a servant of Christ. And I think I don't want that to get confused with the difference between like people pleasing and like serving. I know we're probably going to get into that in a little bit, but I think it could be a huge danger and a huge threat to the calling that God has placed on our lives, because we're more thinking about ourselves. We're more self-oriented as people pleasers. Okay, well, what is this going to do for me? Kind of thing. If I go to this party, I'm going to get more friends. If I go and do this, then I'm going to make these people happy at the expense of what I know is wrong and possibly dealing with consequences. But I'd rather make people happy and show up and do this thing that I know I'm not supposed to do than. So I think that you're kind of tiptoeing on a very, very fine line with people pleasing, because of course, like I said, we're going to get into the whole serving thing in a minute, which I don't want to jump ahead. But it's a huge threat to kind of your faith and your walk with the Lord and what He's called us to do, because people pleasing oftentimes is complete disobedience to His word and what He says. So
Yeah. And I had that same verse in my notes, right? That Galatians 1:10 of, am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Am I trying to please man? Because if I was still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. So like you said, God really lays it out for us, right? You can either follow what I have to say, or you can follow what everybody else, what people have to
mm-hmm.
say. You can either try and please God or you can please man, but you can't do both,
Yeah,
which naturally leads many of us to the question of, okay, well, why? Right? Why can't I do both? Why can't I please God And man, because sometimes it feels like we're getting away with it, and we are. And ultimately, the reason across the board is that what we choose to do isn't what God wants us to do most of the time. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what we call sin, right? That disobedience to God, right? What you talked about. And so we know that God created us to be with Him, right? He's created us for a purpose, but we've all sinned. We've all disobeyed God.
Right.
And because God is perfect, we've been separated from Him then. So now we're stuck in
Yeah.
this position of being separated from God, but being surrounded by people. And we experience God calling us to trust in Him, to live life for Him, to find our purpose, our value, our identity in Him. But the world that we're surrounded by is saying, no, you don't need God. You can figure it out on your own. Like you can do this. Just, love yourself, follow your heart, all those things. And so we have this choice. And so in order for us to have a relationship with God, we've got to, place our faith in what His Son Jesus did for us, right? That He
Right.
lived that perfect life, died on a cross, rose on the third day. And so if we place our trust in Him, we've got that relationship with Him. And that starts for us at the moment of salvation. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we look at this idea of people pleasing, the reason we can't serve both God and man is because we're imperfect,
Mm-hmm.
right? Ultimately, at a core level, all of us are imperfect. And so if I follow what my friends want to do all the time, it's going to lead me down some bad paths because even if they're the greatest person I know, they're still imperfect,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like that old saying that I'm sure everyone's parents or grandparents at some point has said, like, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you do it too?
Yeah.
Right? And it's
Yeah.
kind of a ridiculous scenario in our mind, but that's ultimately reality
Yeah. So
because
true.
we look around at what the world does and we focus on trying to make others happy
Mm-hmm.
because that's what feels good. And that's what we have to be so careful of because our emotions aren't always true. Right? It says in Jeremiah that the heart is deceitful above all things. And so
Mm-hmm.
while my emotions are good and God gave us these emotions, they're not always true, right? Those
Right.
emotions, like you said, of everybody's going to hate me if I don't do this, or if I don't do what they ask me to do, what are they going to think of me? Will I be left out? Will they break up with me? And so I think the danger for us then becomes of people pleasing is that if we live to please man, we're going to ultimately start to water down what pleases God.
Yeah.
And
That's
what I
good.
would say about that is like, I think there's a lot of Christians, right? Both true, committed, faithful Christians and those that kind of just claim that title who have watered down the message of God in order to please man.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you think about all these different topics today, like what God says about marriage, what God says about gender, all these different topics. Well, we have this fear that if we say what I really believe and what God has really laid out for us, then man, I'm gonna upset all these other people. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
gonna be upset with me. They might like say that they hate me, and so that must not be what God really means. Like it's fine. Like we kind of just push it off and say like you can just do what you want to do, make yourself happy because
Mm-hmm.
God wants you to be happy. But then when we look at His Word, like that's not quite God's message.
Right.
Like He wants us to be happy, yes, but not at the expense of us being holy, because true joy can really only be found in Him.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we focus on pleasing others, we'll end up watering down God's message. And the moment we do that, it loses its value and it loses its truth because now we're the ones playing God.
Right.
And so we've talked a lot about people pleasing and what it is. And so to kind of move from that now, how do we avoid it? Right? How do we draw that line, like you've been mentioning, between serving others and pleasing God? Right? What does that look like? What are some tips to help define that line? What would you say?
So we talked about kind of what causes that more people pleasing mindset. A lot of insecurity, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. Um, so I think for me, finding my value and rooting that in who He says I am. And I mean, He's the one who walked to the earth for us and lived a perfect life here on earth. He got nailed to the cross for our trespasses and our sins. And He knows that some people may not love Him and may not accept Him, but He loves them anyway. And that's who we live for. And so when we realize that we're living for something so much bigger than what's here on earth, I think your whole perspective on it changes. I think that instead of being kind of a self-serving person, where a lot of people pleasers kind of are looking to gain from people pleasing more than they are willing to give to people, your mindset kind of changes to more of a people serving kind of aspect. How can I serve this person to glorify God? How can I serve this person to make heaven more crowded, to grow his kingdom, to make his name known through what I do? And so once that becomes your goal, your whole mindset on that changes. Because when your goal changes from yourself and what you can gain from it to how can I make this a gain for the kingdom, I think your whole life changes. Everything just becomes so much easier. My relationships with people, the conversations I have with people, I'm not willing to kind of put my own beliefs on the back burner like I used to, because I know that that's not right. And I know at the end of the day that the person judging me when I leave this earth, I'm not going to stand in front of my coworkers. I'm not going to stand in front of my friends. I'm not going to stand in front of the people that have asked favors from me that I begrudgingly said yes to. I'm going to stand in front of my Father who sent his son to die for me. And that's the only judgment that I care about.
Yeah. And I think so often, to kind of touch on one of the things you mentioned, was like, you know, we do want to say yes, and we have been called to serve, and finding that line of, am I doing this to glorify God, or am I doing this just because I want to appear as a nice person? I want
Yeah.
people to like me. I want to make people happy. And so always wanting to be nice is kind of a trap that a lot of Christians, I believe, fall into, because when you look at the fruit of the Spirit, niceness is not on that list,
Right.
right? It's kindness is on that list. And so we're to be loving towards other people, but sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to say no, right? Not always necessarily being nice, but being honest, being loving, being, just with someone sometimes means saying no. And so if I'm tempted to do something that isn't what I believe God has for me, and if I do this, yeah, I'll be nice and I'm going to be doing what they ask.
Yeah.
Am I going to be missing the point of loving God and loving others because I'm allowing myself to be led to a place where God doesn't want me to be? And so I think the biggest thing is realizing, like, people are always going to let you down, but
Absolutely.
God never will. And so if you're focusing on trying to get your value, your worth, your joy, your satisfaction from other people, it's always going to lead you to a place where it'll fail, because we always fail. Like, that's just in our nature. We're always going to. But the good news is that God never fails. He's always going to take care of us. He's always going to do what's right. He's always going to lead us to a place that will ultimately glorify him. And so if we find our joy in him, that will never fail, regardless of our circumstances. Doesn't mean we're always going to be happy. Like, we'll have ups and downs, but our joy can be constant even in those bad times. And so it's understanding that we were created to serve others,
Right.
but so that we can glorify God,
right?
Not so we can make them happy, not so we can appear as a nice person, but ultimately, like you said, to glorify God. So it's asking ourselves the question, like, am I doing this for that person, or am I doing this for God?
Right.
Like, because he's called me to do it, right? So no matter what we do, right, in word or deed, do it all for the glory of God. And so stopping and thinking, like, all right, am I doing this to glorify God, or am I doing this just to make this other person happy?
Right.
Finding that line, balancing that, and just like you said, staying in that constant communication with God, keeping that relationship so tight that you can always go and check, and you take every thought captive, right? And you're renewing your mind, and all of these different things to help us discern what God's will is, helps us discern whether I'm going to say yes or no to what's in front of me. And so, Makayla, all of this has been super good, super thoughtful. And so, do you have any final thoughts or advice on the topic of people pleasing, or on anything in general that you want to leave before we wrap up this episode?
I kind of want to point back to something that you said in the very beginning about kind of the mindset of the world that we live in today, and the movement of kind of like self empowerment. And I am enough. I am enough. I am enough. As Christians, this is going to sound harsh, but we aren't enough. And I want to make sure that people know that. But God is. And that's why we need him in our lives. That's what keeps us from these vicious cycles of anxiety and fear and people pleasing and all the sins that will run our life if we allow it to. And so I just want to point to the importance of a relationship with him, and not just knowing who he is, but knowing him in a deeper form, being in his word, talking with him, praying with him. That is something that I wish I would have done so much sooner and so much earlier in my life. And I wish I would have taken it seriously years ago, and I didn't. And I suffered the consequence of that for a few years. And while it is a part of my testimony, and I'm glad I can share that with people, I just want to save some of the people from the hurt that I experienced from it. So,
Yeah. And I think you hit it perfectly to just touch back on what you said. Like, we're not enough. And, I think back to the story of Moses where he's constantly going to God saying, God, I'm not enough. I'm not equipped. I'm not able. I can't do this. And God answers by like reminding Moses of who he is, right? Moses says, I'm not enough. And, God says, like, I am.
yeah.
Right? Not only is that a name of God, but it's God reminding us that when we aren't enough, he is. Right? You're right. I'm not enough. I can't do this on my own strength. Like, that's one of the lies that we believe as Christians, is that like God's not going to give us more than we can handle.
Right.
That's a lie. God oftentimes gives us way more than we can handle. Like, I know in my life, he's given me so much more than I can handle. But I believe he does that to point us back to our need for him.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
if I am enough, if I can always handle everything he's given me, then I have no need for him. Like, I can be my own savior if I can work myself out of every problem I have. If, I can always please people and make everybody happy and I can keep everything under control, then what do I need him for?
Right.
But I think it's when he gives us more than we can handle, when he reminds us that we're not enough, and when we can stay in that mind frame, it brings us back to a place of understanding our need for him. And that ultimately we're reminded just in his name, I am, that he is enough. In everything we're going to encounter, he's enough. And so keeping our focus on him first and foremost in our life is the most important thing, and everything else flows from that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this has been great. Hopefully, if you're a people pleaser, this has maybe shed some light on some things you can maybe start applying to your life to help you kind of break out of that cycle. And maybe if you came into this episode thinking you weren't a people pleaser, and maybe now you feel that conviction, this will help you move forward with Christ and learn to say no to some of those things. And so if this has been of a help to you, however you're watching, listening to this, share it with someone that you think it might help. Don't text them and say like, hey, people pleaser, listen to this, right? Don't do that. But share it with somebody, because we hope that this can encourage and equip you to live your life for Christ and to help you reach those around you with this message of hope. So thanks so much for listening. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss another one, and we'll see you next week. Peace.
Bye.